one on each. Yeah. This may seem a bit weird to have a microphone out for our little crowd. It's for anyone who's watching online. Hello. Thank you for coming out. It's very sunny Edinburgh night. My name is Mary. I run Lighthouse, and it is my absolute pleasure to be welcoming William Hussey. Am I saying that right? Hussey to the bookshop.
Thank you.
Who is the author of the very brilliant, gory, grisly, twisty, funny, gothic crime novel that is all of these very many things and more, as well as a dozen other books you've written.
Yeah, roughly. Yeah, I think that's number 13. So okay. I don't know if that's lucky or not.
Seems fitting.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we are going to have a little bit of a chat around killing Jericho, and then you will also have a chance to ask the questions yourself. But before we launch into that, will you all join me in putting your hands together to welcome William? So before I launch into my question, and I put words into your mouth because it's the book that does defy much characterization, will you tell our readers just a quickly of the plot and who Scott Jericho is? So what is this book?
Absolutely. So basically, it's the background to Scott Jericho comes from my background. I grew up son of a traveling showman, so I traveled on fairgrounds myself, and I always thought that traveling fairground people would make brilliant detectives. And I've got a tiny little anecdote before I get to the plot, which was I was looked after quite a lot in my youth by 3 aged aunts who were like 3 weird sisters who lived up in a caravan all together, and they would run the hooker duck stall, which my great granddad apparently invented the hooker duck stall, which is pretty cool. And but they were brilliant because I'd be sitting there playing with a little kind of action figure or something, and half listening, and they'd be talking about the punters who come on their stall during the day. And it would go a bit like this. So one woman would say, "Oh, did you see the nurse who came up earlier?" And I would say, "How do you know she was the nurse? She wasn't in uniform." They go, "Oh, when she went to check the time, she did that first before she looked at her wristwatch." So as a nurse would. And she said, and then the other one would say, "Oh yeah, that husband won't be with her very long." And you were like, "How do you know that?" Go, "We didn't you see his ring finger? Like how the knuckle on his ring finger was worn away from taking his wedding ring on and off quite regularly." And she went, "Yeah, but she won't be too bothered because she's having something to do with one of the chaps who's running the Dodgers." "Yeah, how do you know that?" "Oh, because I was passing his trailer the other day and there were these 2 little holes in the wet ground outside that just matched the stilettos of her heels that she was wearing today." And it was like, wow, they were never wrong. The cheating nurse and the philandering husband, that definitely happened. So I always thought they would be brilliant detectives, and because their observation skills are brilliant, they had to be great observers of the people who came on the fair, because they'd only have a couple of hours each night to kind of earn their living, and they couldn't waste it on people who were just passing by. So they observed people very quickly. The fair is the last great level. So all human life comes to the fair, from thin men to lords. So they get to know people, they suss them out. And they're great at getting the gap, like winning people's confidences and just kind of, So all of those skills are brilliant. So I always thought that a traveller detective would be fantastic. So Killing Jericho is basically about a man who's been brought up in the life. He's a gay man. He leaves the life at 18, and through a series of misadventures, he joins the police force. And there's a case he's assigned where a far-right fascist group have petrol bombed a Polish food store, and 3 young children have died in the ensuing arson attack. And Jericho is assigned the case, and he's interviewing this fascist thug, and he just loses his temper and beats the guy up, and so he's drummed out the force. This fascist guy comes after him, sues him in a civil case, so he loses everything. So beginning of the book, he's forced to go back to the fairground family one trip, and he's on a downward spiral. And then suddenly a case is brought to him, and So 150 years ago, the Jericho family were running a freak show in the Victorian age, and there was an accident as one of the loads was going over a bridge in Kent, and the bridge collapsed, and lots of people, 5 people drowned. And now, 150 years later, it appears that a murderer is recreating the deaths of these people who died 150 years ago. But the victims apparently have no connection to each other. And it's only Jericho who knows the legend of the story, who's able to piece it together and eventually work out who is doing it and why they're doing it.
I'm always worried when I summarize her novels that I'm going to give something away. And this gets pretty twisty pretty early. On the opening page, we get to meet him, and it is, we have a combination of first traveler jargon and then him kicking Michelangelo's butt out of his bed. So it's immediately, nails the colours to the mast.
Yes.
Very gay, very unapologetic. Was that always the plan for this to be the Daily Mail's worst nightmare of the detective?
Yeah, gay traveller detective. He's going to rile up the Daily Mail reader. So he's absolutely. I grew up a gay man, traveling fairground world, and I wanted to present the community in all its positive aspects, and such a supportive community. I always say that I could go to a fairground in Edinburgh if something had happened to me, if I'd been mugged or something, and I wouldn't know necessarily the travelling people on the fairground. I would give my name, and they would give me a bed for the night, money, and help me out. And that's a network all around the country and even abroad. That's wonderful. However, there's a conservative in that. So being LGBTQ within the travelling community is a challenge, and one that Scott faces, and essentially it's why he leads life. It's a lot better than it used to be when I was growing up, but it's still. So I wanted, in that first page, because also crime, there's a minority of crime readers who are quite socially alert. And that's why they like crime novels, because in a typical crime novel, the world is shaken up, and then a detective comes in and puts the world back to order. So it's can be quite a socially conservative genre. And I didn't want it to be like that. I wanted it to be, from the very open page, that it's going to be shaken up, and it's going to be shaken up at the end, but at the beginning. And again, we can't go into spoilers, but the way that you can understand why when we find out what's really been happening, why it's still shaken up and not ultimately resolved in a kind of neat little bow, the way that certain readers would like. So what I wanted people to do was, if they saw that on the shelf in a bookshop, to open it up and to actually see from the first page, is that for me or is that for me? Because we've got clearly a traveller who's got the travel jargon. He's just had sex with a guy on the who works on the fair as well. So just proudly proclaiming what it is.
Doesn't treat that particularly well.
He doesn't.
So you do have like the damage detected trope in there, and then sort of subverted. I've never thought of a crime reader that way, but it totally makes sense. Connecting to that and genre, you're known for your YA, which often has this beautiful romance streak. You've got gothic horror tropes that, why crime now? And were you conscious of putting some of that into this book?
Yeah, I mean, crime fiction was my first love when I was a kid. So I love virtually every kind of genre of fiction, but crime fiction was my first love. So my grandfather used to read me Sherlock Holmes stories when I was a kid, and I was very precocious about Sherlock Holmes. I absolutely loved it. So when I actually got kicked, when I was about 8, I got kicked off the Sherlock Holmes walk in London because I corrected the tour guide. About said that didn't happen in the Priory School, that happened in the Abbey Grange. So, but so the American tourists loved it because like this 8-year-old correctly. But yeah, so I always loved crime fiction. I loved Christie, and I'm a great defender of Agatha Christie because she gets a lot of flack about the quality of her writing, but I mean that might be a brow depending on Christie, but and also the fact that she has got a reputation and deserved in some respects of being a conservative writer who had some definitely problematic language in some of her books. And yet, in probably my favourite Agatha Christie book, which has an echo in Jericho 2, A Murder is Announced, you've got, written in the 1950s, you've got a sympathetic and very beautiful lesbian relationship with two older women who live together in this village. And, and it's lovely, and yet she used to be, there's no judgment in the book about it. They're just presented as a very loving couple. And that's very subversive in the 1952 genre.
Yeah.
But anyway, so I've always loved crime fiction. So, but the thing is, I think because I loved it so much, I was intimidated about writing it. So I loved horror, but I didn't revere horror writers to the extent I revered crime writers. I love romance stories and I love adventure stories. So it just took a little while, and I've been thinking of Jericho as a character for years. The other thing is, I was a bit nervous about writing about the community that I grew up in and maybe getting some backlash from them because I wanted to portray that community in an honest way. So with all the brilliant stuff as well. So it just took me quite a while to get around to it.
But then it meant you could put all the other stuff in it too.
Exactly.
On that note of it being sort of slightly controversial, I mean, hundreds of years of social and specifically police persecution of traveller people and show people. And yet here is a detective. And it is the police is not the solution in a lot of the book. But did you mentioned being nervous about making this a crime book that was rooted in your community. Did that shape then what you were able to do with the narrative, or what you wanted to make sure did get shown, so people would get a chance to see something complex but also not falling into all those garbage tropes?
Well, exactly. So firstly, as I say in the book, up until fairly recently, the fairground travelling community, because the word traveller is a very broad umbrella term, and lots of different groups fit under it. But the fairground aspect of it, you would come into the town, you provide entertainment for people for like a weekend, and then it's like, we've had enough of you now, go. We don't want you here anymore. And so I wanted those obvious parallels that Jericho actually says when he goes into this very kind of like, London belt kind of town that is very nice and pretty and almost chocolate box kind of England. And then as he drives in, he sees protests in very neatly ordered lawns, anti-mosque, anti-Islam. And Jericho's like, we are now seen as travellers, as a British eccentricity, as a kind of like cutesy thing. Oh, aren't they lovely? But only a couple of decades ago, they would have been run out of town, same as other minorities persecuted. And that goes back again to like 150 years. The tragedy at the heart of the book, the bridge collapse that happened 150 years ago, is a real thing. So it actually happened to family members of mine. And so they were going over a bridge in Kent, bridge collapsed, it was hot picking season, and about 30 people drowned. And there was a kind of like thing within the travel community, like we weren't really wanted there because it was always thought, oh, we're going to undercut wages, because that's the thing that's always thrown at any kind of minority group that comes to say, oh, they're going to undercut the wages for everyone else, and it's and so we'll talk the bridge weekend, on that basis. So yeah, and the as far as like the aspect of police and travel, it's always been an uncomfortable relationship. So Jericho joining, as he says in the book, I think he says, I became the Islamic to a Jew,
Right.
and I joined the Jews. And that is, they have the word for them, the gathers. You don't talk to the gathers, and you don't, so but they still take you back.
Yeah.
Even after all of that, they still take you back.
Yeah. And the police will still kick his tires on his home, like.
Absolutely. And the other thing is, I think generally, it's not just a police thing, but generally people don't have a very deep understanding about the differences between communities under that traveller umbrella. There are, it's like putting putting every single Asian community under that one thing, saying everyone can say there's not, there's differences, but within the kind of like the fairground traveller community, you're tending to get less of the outward prejudice that a lot of other travellers get. But the other thing is, what I wanted to do is, and there may be some, I haven't read it, but I had never read a crime novel, virtually anyone, that had fiction-wise thriller, that had been written by someone with travellers in it, who'd been written by someone who was a traveller, who had grown up in life. So what you tend to find is, especially see on TV, is you'll see fairgrounds going in somewhere, you'll read about it, and it will be the totally wrong traveller community who are running the fairground. So they will have things like Romany caravans and fairground traveller people. They don't have those caravans, and yet we'll see them, we read about them, and all that kind of like hackney things of like checkered neckerchiefs and things like that. And it's all wrong. It's just all wrong. So yeah.
But it's that performance that people will recognize somehow.
Yes.
Like, oh, this is in my mind's eye, this is what fair people look like.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a bit grim. Not as grim as the crimes that are committed. And I didn't realize it was based on a true story. Can you tell us a bit about the process and the research, whether that was into getting the police side, the investigative side down, or the other way around, like what it was to go back into your own family, find the roots of it, and then make it something that would work.
Yeah.
It's modern crime.
On the police side, I had my friend, version of my life, who works. So he was like, I just phoned him up, said, is this feasible? And if it's feasible, it can go in. If he's like, it might not, it could happen, that's fine. I can go, because we had a point where obviously Jericho is, because of his attack, he got bail petition.
Yes.
Not bail, it's probation. And it was like he has to go out of the country at one point. And it was like, oh God, he's not going to be allowed to go out of the country, but he kind of needs to. So there was a way around it, which Dave helped me out with. On the actual, it was really fascinating the research, because our family, like my great grandfather, was friends with Tom Norman, called the Silver King, and he was around in late Victorian era. He was the showman who exhibited the elephant and in the East End, and I read his handwritten diary, which had never been published, and just give me some insight into that area. And I always say it's not in any way to excuse that whole aspect, because there is no excuse. It's horrific to exhibit people for money, is horrific. But sometimes you have to look back on an age which we don't live in, which doesn't have the social kind of like safety net we have. So for lots of those people, these are the choices. You could travel with the fairground and have that awful stuff happen to you and be exhibited and laughed at and ridiculed. Or you could go to the workhouse, or you could be institutional, or you could die in the street. Those are the choices. And what was interesting about, I mean, I don't know whether you've seen David Lynch's, you know, the other man in the 80s, the show that portrayed a very abusive individual. In actual fact, there was some autonomy within that thing. So often they were paid better than the showmen who exhibited them. And if they were ill-treated, they'd just go to a rival outfit. And so, again, not to excuse it, it's horrific, but it's not quite, it's more of a nuanced picture. And so that was really interesting to kind of like read his diaries and get
the diaries are kept in the family.
Yes, kept in the family. And then the other thing is, so again, going back to kind of like how the relationship with criminality, the police, and traveling people. When basically a society makes it impossible for a community to earn a living without criminality, and then judges for it, what are people supposed to do? So it's quite amusing story. So Tom Norman used to go into a city like Edinburgh, for example, out on a Friday, just before all the letting agencies were about to close for the weekend. And he especially did it, you know, during a long weekend or holiday or something. And he would say, he would go in his best clothes, look very lordly, and he would say, I'm thinking of buying 3 or 4 of these shops on the main high street, but I'm only here until Sunday afternoon, and I can drop the keys back to the thing, but I need to go in there, assess them. I'm only here, and he would flash them cash. So it would look, you know, we can give them any money, so you flash them cash, and they would give him the key. And so what he would do is he'd open a show on the main high street in Edinburgh for free, and take a load of money, and then give the keys back on Sunday and say, it's not for me, sorry. And but no one was renting that space legitimately.
Yeah.
And I remember things like my family, like, well, I don't remember it. The stories were that they would go onto the fairground. They would basically be living hand to mouth. So sometimes they couldn't afford fuel to power their generators, you know, for their rides and stuff. But they would plug into the nearest lamppost and have electricity for free off the nearest lamppost. But it's like they would be paying all their taxes and stuff. They'd be scraping a living and living hand to mouth. There was certainly when my dad was young, there was no social security. Because you had no fixed address, we were talking about it before we started, if you had no fixed address, you couldn't get dole money. So you were pushed into a thing where to earn a living, society won't let you earn a living legitimately. You have to find little weeds and ways of doing it. And that was why then, you know, when the police would come on and then unhook, and then they're like, right, well now, how am I going to feed my kids? Because I can't run a fair, and now I can't feed my kids. So the police were always seen as the enemy within that environment. And so when Scott joins the police, and Scott, I think in the book, he really joins, he's got a massive sense of justice. Like, he doesn't want bad people doing bad things. But he also, it's more to do with the fact that he enjoys the puzzle of people. You know, he is not there he wouldn't join the police to enforce petty. I mean, I was thinking about this the other day during the coronation thing, with when the protesters were, and Scott would have been like, come through, more of you the merrier. But it's he wouldn't, you know, he's not there for that. He's there to uphold justice and also to solve. He just craves the public humanity.
He's got a real itch for the puzzle.
Yeah.
Which kind of, as a reader, gives you the itch for the puzzle. Like, you're very invested in the solving to the point where, as you go along, you become less. Well, I became less and less scrupulous about that. I'm just like, yeah, no, I'm also give it not a real human being. It's you look at the theme. No, the puzzle in it is tremendously well done. And it is, you know, it is interesting looking at, I think, that awakening to a sense that the police, like, how ridiculous it was even offloading a bunch of banners from you know, I had my first arrest last week. Yeah, no, I feel like a badass and an idiot because I was asleep and I was dragged out of a tent by my ankle by a, like just your average dog's body, and it's like, what are you doing in the woods, harassing people at a peaceful protest?
Yeah.
And then and I loved going back to some bits of the book ahead of tonight's conversation, and the way he is in the police, of the police, and yet fundamentally not. The police are not investigating a series of crimes necessarily the way that they could or should, and it takes him to solve a puzzle or follow a puzzle.
I think his kind of mentor in the book, I think he says it, or unless I looked it out, I'm not quite sure, but it stands that his view of Scott is, you're a great detective and a terrible police, because they are two very different things.
Yeah, that's exactly it, right?
Yeah.
In terms again of sort of genre and piecing things together, and I'm conscious that you will probably also have questions, and I haven't checked. How are we doing for time? Yeah, right. And then I'll also check might be if you have questions online, then feel free to check them out. In terms of piecing all those little bits together, and a little bit of your own history, and then feel free to grab a chair or pull it up. Mining what could go in. Was there any line that you sort of thought Scott Jericho could cross, or a piece of jargon? Was there certain aspects of just the language that is used by show people that felt like, I can give you a glimpse at this world, but I'm not going to show you everything, or I'm going to give you a taste, but I'm going to leave you wanting more? Was there like council too far?
Yeah, I mean, so in book 2 we get to explore a different aspect of the traveller world, which is about the side of it that deals with a kind of almost mysticism. So I can kind of give you like a little idea of book 2 because it's be out in February, but it's a murderer who's targeting psychics, mediums, fortune tellers, and at the end of this book, it's like Scott is like, I am done. I'm done with this. So I'm like, but then this to make the mistake of targeting someone close to Scott, so a fortune teller who works like on with the bear, and that's a good idea. You don't do that. So, but it's there are loads of different aspects that we've only really scraped the surface of. As far as like the community is concerned, again, it's more explored in book 2, but when it hits home to them, if you hurt one of them, you don't want to do that, basically. And like they will, again, it's a very frank discussion within the book what the community response to that be like, and Scott knows as well. So his investigation, as he says to Harry in the love interest, but investigation is not so much fueled by his rage. Someone's hurt someone's like him in the community, but it's also protect the community. He knows what they do, correct someone who hurts one of them. So it's kind of like, it's there is sense, and I never want to push it too far. It's not true to say it's a law unto themselves. That's not entirely true. But they have their own rules and sets and standards that, for better, good or ill, they abide by. But yeah, so that would be more explored in book 2. We've got some more different jargon in book 2 as well. So yeah, one of my favourite ones ever sounds so kind of like evocative words is melody. So if something's melody, it's scary or spooky or unsettling. So
So it's going to be as like unsettling-y, gothic-y.
It's going to be as melody. So yeah, it is. Yeah, it's So as I say, it's a serial killer who's apparently targeting people, and I can't really say because his methodology is one with. I can't say much about how he's murdering. So
yeah, it's only slightly disturbing how creative it gets with the death. Does anyone in the room have any questions? Yeah, go for it.
You have another book out this week as well.
Yeah.
And I think as a writer, for me, I always struggle to, sorry, like, but I always struggle to like technique. So you've got two very different genres that are very small, like window. How do you separate like the subject? Do you give weight to one or the other? And for the technical, I love the outreach for young adults. This scene is more for adults. How do you separate yourself as a writer?
Yeah, it's a good question. And also, they're coming out very close together, but they actually weren't written very close together. So it's kind of, it's just how publishing schedules work. And but yeah, I think it's basically just because how I approach it. Like someone said to me the other day, do you approach writing kids differently? These and I don't really, because it's all I do is I love lots of different genres of fiction. I love YA, I love adult crime, gory horror, I love all kinds of stuff. And I just kind of sit down and think, right, I'm now going to approach this as a lover of this type of book, and what would I like to read within that genre? And when I do the YA stuff, so when I do this stuff, I write YA stuff, hopefully as intensely as I write this stuff, and then I leave it to my editor to kind of say to me, you need to pull back on this, or this is a bit too much, especially in the outrage, because there was lots of violence in the outrage. In Britain, that's, you know, now. No, it's 30 years from now, which was, you know, looking back on it, it's much too far in the future. But it was, you know, there's lots of violence in that, and we had like a lot of debates with my brilliant editor about how far we can go with it. And my thing is that I think teenagers have a very acute antennae when it comes to them being patronised or spoken down to, or being coddled. And so I just go as far as I go, and then I trust an editor to draw me back when they feel they need to. But obviously with these ones, I can go as far as I like, and we can have kind of like people with helium balloons for eyes and things like that. So, but also we were saying before this, there are instances of violence in them, but actually a lot of the time you might close the book and think, oh, I saw some really gory horror murders. You don't see anyone murdered in the book. You find the discovery of the bodies, or the bodies are, you know, a scene of crime, scene photographs. You don't actually.
Yes, and you encounter them the way that he sees them. Yes. So you're almost piecing in, you don't get the full scene, you get bit by bit as he looks his way around a photograph or
or a crime scene or whatever it might have to be. But the other thing is, so we had a lovely review in Times recently, and it was great. And there was one of the little lines which I could have been seen as a criticism. It said something about the ending being a bit kind of like over the top or something like that. But I think the reviewer was saying it in a way that was kind of a compliment, because it's kind of a heightened reality. The book is a kind of like gothic horror story in a way, as well as a detective story. And so what I wanted to do with the book was to encompass 3 different genres of science fiction that I love. So one was the detective story, which is Edgar Allan Poe, Murders in the Street, and which is a horror story, you know, a brutal, violent, but very elevated kind of like heightened reality. I wanted that. I love Agatha Christie, so almost like the bloodless puzzle mystery element. But I also loved Raymond Chandler, Philip Marlowe's private investigator type stuff. And Philip Marlowe hated Agatha Christie. He actually said once that with Murder on the Orient Express, he said it's so ingenious that only a halfway can solve it. Which a bit rude, really. But I wanted to kind of try and bring the gothic horror element, the kind of PI thing of Philip Marlowe, and the kind of puzzle element of Agatha Christie, and try to mesh them all together in one book.
Yeah, and I think also it never gets too much, because there's an immense tenderness, I think, for Harry, for his love interest, even in the relationship with his father in all of the like the little moments or little insights, like his great love of libraries, born of many thefts, fed by many thefts rather. So yeah, so between you're not sort of steeped in the horror, but you're sort of dangled over the cliff edge by him along the way with all the other stuff that makes you really invested in someone who is very damaged and problematic. And, you know,
and I think kind of like and like I think Scott would even like say that he's problematic because you know. But the other thing is, so when I was plotting out how he was back then, and then when I started thinking about it, I thought we need him because it's too dark without him. And
you were right.
Yeah, yeah. And he's like, I have so many. I've had like lots of readers say to me, read it already, and they say, so there's a dog, well, Webster, like this lovable old dog, and it like they said, we love Scott, but you can really feel we like him because we kind of like him keep getting damaged kind of stuff. But please don't do anything to Harry or Webster when you're in trouble.
Yeah, as we heard towards the ending, it's like
Don't hurt the dog, don't hurt the gay boyfriend, you're in trouble.
do we have any other questions in the room? There was also one online that I can lead seamlessly. From Joe, in the movie of the book, it is very cinematic. Apart from in the movie of the book, who plays Scott Jericho and who plays Harry?
Oh wow. Well,
thanks, Joe.
So my partner Chris is here, he's a brilliant artist, and he drew Scott Jericho first. So we had a competition. Yeah, and it's brilliant, and he almost like plucked into my mind, and that's what he looks like. And so I feel he's a little bit like like Poldark in Poldark, but he needs to be a little bit bigger. He needs to be a little bit beefier because he's a bit of a beefy guy. Scott, but I think for Harry, I really don't. Overall, trying to think. I don't know if anyone's got any suggestions. Let me know, but I can't think of someone for Harry.
Everyone's got to send their suggestions afterwards.
Exactly. Yeah.
No, I definitely get that sort of brooding, dark, curly, dark curl thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, built like a brick shit house.
Yeah. We he's that's the other thing. We set out what he looks like pretty early on, so it's not wishful thinking at all, honestly. Sure.
Does anyone have another question? It can be about the other books as well, because this one is fresh, off fresh.
Oh. Now I'm nervous.
Something I wonder, I've never actually asked you. The murders are very creative. They're also fucked up. Does that come naturally?
I'm disturbing that you're asking.
Right, or is that
I find it very disturbing my partner. Yeah.
I love that you're asking that with an audience.
But I mean, it was always a bit of a kind of the other book that I insisted my granddad taking when I was a Jack the Ripper book. It was kind of like, I mean, we turned up the thing and they went, you're not that to Jack the Ripper book, you're right. And but yeah, I always kind of like had a bit of a really gory side. It's just kind of it sounds terrible, but it was actually really fun in Jericho, and kind of like actually a friend of mine who's a brilliant horror writer once said to me, and he did some romance as well. He said you go to a horror convention, it's horror right, and they are the nicest people you could ever imagine because all their darkness is filled out. If you go to a romance thing, and it's like the worst human being you've ever met in your entire life. They have to be lovely all the time, and then it's like, so it's almost a catharsis, I guess. You know,
It's all out on the
it's
page
all out. Yeah, exactly.
until the next book. You just brewing.
I know. This is why these books need to be edited first, and we need to get, we need to. I'm contracted for 3, but we need to, because for my own sanity, I need to keep writing them.
Let it all hang out.
I know.
I love that. We're running our first ever and Scotland's first ever romance festival in June. So I will brace myself for some salty bitches. Then we'll do horror. You're right. Crime writers are always a really crime and horror, a really jolly bunch.
Really nice people. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, there was romance in Killing Jericho as well. I guess. So
all of your other books you've distilled like the good stuff. Because again, there's a statement on fascism, right? The right.
Yeah.
You've got the ugliness of Little Britain in there, the romance, and the horror, and the gothic. Things that almost go on for the night.
Yeah.
Big mansions, fires.
Yeah, and I kind of I always wanted as well, because in the book, Jericho is haunted by the children who he feels that he let down because by him attacking the prime suspect, the case collapses. So these kids didn't get justice, and he sees them, and I always wanted it to be open in the book. Are they real, or are they part of his PTSD hallucination? I never wanted definitive answers to that. And this book, in a way, is a kind of exorcism of Jericho, kind of almost like, because in book 2, there will be other ghosts. So,
Unlucky, but Jericho.
I know it's always going to be haunted. What is Harry letting himself in?
He's very deeply loved.
But he's very handsome as well, so let's
do we have we have one. Go for it.
You mentioned that you've got 3 books, so do you know where the end of all 3 is, or where to refuse and how people might see the book? Well, you maybe well, the end of it.
Yeah. Well, I do. Yeah, I know book 2's finished, and I know it's going to happen in book 3, and it will. I'm writing it as effectively a trilogy, but with an idea for book 4 as well. So it really just depends on how well the students and whether we get what I hope so. It's been going pretty well so far, first few weeks and stuff. I think what I tend to do is I read reviews for maybe about the first couple of weeks before I put them down and I start reading them. But I think it's not a good idea to start changing characters, storylines according to individual reactions, because it will be so contradictory as well. And what I tend to do is just sit down with my agent, tell him my ideas, and gauge his reaction. Because he's absolutely brilliant at story construction, especially all agents are. And, I mean, again, the only thing that I've been instructed, which I'll kind of stick to, is, well, all I can promise is Webster will survive all 3 books. We cannot hurt Webster. My only regret with Webster is the regret Agatha Christie had about Poirot was that he was old when she started writing about him. He was in his 60s. So when he died in 1970, he was supposed to be 143 years old. My regret is that Webster is an old dog at the beginning of Killing Jericho, and I basically can't. He's just forever. He's going to have to be an immortal dog. No one can give.
What What breed is he?
He's a boxer.
How old is
He is so quite old. I think he's about 12.
he? Okay, we'll take this guy.
Oh, he's gonna be quite.
You could probably
Yeah.
get to like 22 or something.
Yeah.
which
He was
was
cool. He was called Webster after so Scott's mom, who we don't know why she's but she called him Webster after the playwright John Webster because he's like a glorious Jacobean playwright, and Webster just loves killing the rats on the fairground. So he's a very literary animal.
The glorious creature.
Glory.
So just on that note, around like the role that your agent played in the publishing process and the book, did you have any pushback, or were you because you write queer books, there's clearly an audience, but there's a lot more in that. Were you concerned that the publishing industry rather than readers would be like, there just isn't going to be the interest for this?
For a queer traveler.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
Well,
think,
like you can have one, but you can't have both.
well, yeah, I think that Bonnier never, ever, to their credit, said anything about that. And I can imagine other publishers would have kind of thought, yeah, it's like too much. But it's kind of like, so that's it's like it might be a bit on the this, but about 6 years ago, bringing someone had Marty Rowe's book, which has a character called Noah, who's an unapologetically gay detective working there. And so there have been gay, very sensitive detectives before, but yeah, I mean, it isn't. Unfortunately, this is the world we live in. It is going to put some people off. And I think the other reality, which is again, Bonnier, is it's going to limit the number of the other areas where we can sell it. Because if you have like a grizzled, old, white, alcoholic, straight detective, then you can sell that virtually any foreign territory. It's absolutely fine.
Right.
But we can think of territories where this might be a challenge. So all credit to them for really getting behind it. And so I've been really blown away by they produce a hardback, which is very difficult for, especially for David. I've been writing about David Prime, and they've done an amazing job to cover.
Yeah.
And the other thing, what I love about it is they've been really brave and bold by taking on this story, but also like to really get behind the vibe of it, to not cut out the like so many other crime covers, which is just a shadowy detective with a just a dark blue cover or something like that. When you see that on kind of a crime shelf, it does pop. So
It's also got like a million accolades. You seem very well read and quoted.
Yeah, bless them. I didn't have to pay them very much either. No, they were
like a lot of crime mates, or like they were like, everyone's gonna read this, and I suppose it's a very new proposition. If you read and love crime, then there's something really original in what you were saying.
Yeah, I mean, one or two of the people I knew and approached myself said, just finding out. Like Sarah Pimber has been a friend of mine for a long, long time. But a lot of the others I didn't know. And the only one I knew a little bit and he was really busy finishing his PhD, so left him doing it, was John Conley.
Okay.
And his
PhD. Oh, cool.
Yeah, I mean, and his Charlie Parker, the real model for me for Jericho, that kind of PI and kind of lone wolf, and I mean, there's a lot in common, I think, between that genre of detective story and the old-fashioned kind of Western, the lone gunslinger who comes into town, no one knows who he is in the community. He rights the wrongs and then he's gone again. And this was, in a way, how I pitched Jericho to my agent and to my editor, is the kind of like the idea that the fair who do we have now who is like the Lone Gunman, who can travel anywhere, who's not like other detectives who are pinned down to a city, as great as all that is, like Rebus is in Edinburgh and Morse is in Oxford, and they might travel a little bit, but with this guy, he can go anywhere. And he is like, I say, that lone gunman who goes into town, no one knows him, and he sorts stuff out, for good or ill, but he impacts the community, and then he's gone again.
Yeah, and I suppose he's not tied into the disgraced police officer who served his time in jail, so he has the freedom of everything that would have come with connections and knowledge and training in the police, while not being tied to procedure.
Yeah, and in book 2 we get to that little hiatus period that he had between, so he goes to Oxford, so he leaves, and he wants to go to Oxford because he wants to talk about, I had this experience when I went to university. You go to your university, you're from a travelling fairground background, and what you want to do is talk about books and literature and that world. And as soon as you mention you're from a travelling fairground community, all those people want to do is talk about your world. You don't want to talk about that. So he has that, and then he meets Harry, and then that goes really wrong. And then he has that little hiatus, which he only touches on in the book about he was in virtually the criminal underworld, and he was like stuck for hire before he joined the police. But we find out a lot more about that part of his life too.
Are there any last burning questions? Well, you can always come up and ask a question. You're decided up in front of everyone. You should check online, but well, I have those on. But will you join me finally in a big round of applause and a big thank you to Hussey, and congratulations.